Hello, welcome to this presentation on how we're going to calculate grades for Year 11s for 2021. Just for transparency, this isn't the presentation that I gave on Monday, the 1st of March. That ended up being a meeting which lasted over an hour, just answering some of the parent questions, not all of which were related to grade calculation. So I'm recording this on Tuesday, the 2nd of March. And it'd be a little bit briefer, which will make for viewing it online a little bit easier. So at this point, I'm just going to share my screen with you and take you through a presentation which goes through what we intend to do this year. So ultimately, we are in a situation where the government have announced that we do not have to do any exams, and ultimately we would be in a position where we could just predict student grades now with no additional evidence, but I'm not prepared to do that. I don't think that would be fair. Students have all had slightly different experiences due to lockdown and to their kind of own self-isolation. And also there's still plenty of time for students to demonstrate their abilities. But most importantly, we need to be transparent and equitable in the process of generating grades. And we haven't gone through a process of moderation across the year, or really benchmarking against exam standards. So any grades given up to this point don't have the credibility which I would feel would be required for accurately predicting student grades. There has to be transparency in our assessment methodology, and therefore at the end of the month, hopefully earlier in April, we will start receiving information from the exam boards, and they'll be sending through the assessment materials that they would have used in a normal exam season with the mark schemes for us to use and to be able to moderate across the year. And it's my intention to use as many of those exam board set assessment materials as we can, but in a very different way to the formal exams that we would do in a normal year. Now, I need to start this by benchmarking really what I expect to come out of this process. Last year, we didn't announce the grades achieved by our Year 11 simply because it was unprecedented. They didn't do examinations and we didn't feel it was comparable to other years, but obviously we're in a similar situation going through. So I'm going to let you know where we were. We achieved 72% of students achieved English and maths at 4+, which is the old grade C standard. 75% got 4+ in maths, English 80% got 4+. And the performance of that cohort has been almost identical to the current Year 11 all the way through. Their performance in Year 7, 8, 9 and the part of 10 that we were assessing was very, very similar. So I would expect at the end of this process, the outcomes to be very, very similar again. With the one caveat that actually this current Year 11 are demonstrating and have demonstrated for the last 2 years more students achieving 7, 8s and 9s than last year. But generally, I just wanted to point that out because just because we're in a scenario where teachers are predicting grades, I need to clarify that there still needs to be a transparency. The reason those students got 72% and 75% in maths and 80% in English was because that's the ability they demonstrated. This isn't a case of just giving the grades that students want. It still has to be validated in the work that students do. So we intend to start assessments in the week back after Easter, so the week commencing the 26th of April. And these may continue all the way through to the May half term. We're only going to set papers where the content has been covered, and students will be prepared for the test that they're doing. So that's why we're not starting the assessments the 26th of April, because simply I don't see there's any value in students coming back next week and immediately being tested when they've clearly not had the preparation that would be required for them to really do well in those. So they're going to come back as soon as we're aware of our testing schedule, bearing in mind we only got the information on Wednesday last week about how exams would be configured, and our teachers are working that out now. We will let students know when each of the tests are going to be, and more importantly, we're going to let them know what the content of those tests are going to be, and then we're going to support them to prepare them. So in class time, there'll be revision and there'll be lessons geared towards those individual tests to make sure that all of the students are in the best possible position to actually take those. And that obviously takes time. I want to get rid of this kind of, oh, you've got a test tomorrow type scenario, so students are fully prepared. So we start in that week commencing the 26th of April and go all the way through to the May half term. There may be some tests after the May half term, but I'll talk about the timescales later on, and I don't expect there to be large-scale testing after the May half term. We're only set the papers where the content has been covered, so if students have not completed parts of a curriculum because of the lockdown or absence, they won't be tested in those areas. And as a result of that, I've also said to teachers not to teach anything new from this point onwards, with very small exceptions. And what I mean by a small exception is if a teacher has been teaching a year 11 unit of work and they've basically done 95% of it and they just need a couple of extra pieces in there just to complete the unit, then that to me is a small exception. If you're in a subject like science and you haven't even started additional biology yet, I'm not saying science are in that situation, but if they were, I'd be saying, right, we're not starting additional biology, we'll do the assessment on the material that's been covered, and we'll do the testing on the material that's been covered. It's not the student's fault that because of the disruption to education that there may be areas missing. And I would say that, you know, Knole Academy is in a very good position. We've missed a lot less school than an awful lot of other establishments, and we're much further along in terms of the curriculum that we have delivered. If you're intending to go on and study at A-level or IB and some of the subjects where we haven't completed the entire syllabus, I would suggest speaking to the teachers and over the summer going over that material, but it won't be assessed. The reason for the testing in one way is to generate rank orders for the students. In the big subject areas, especially English, math, science, modern foreign language, geography, history, where you've got multiple teachers and multiple classes, it's very difficult to aggregate performance from one class to another. So all students will sit exactly the same tests, with the exception of as higher and foundation tier, that all of the higher will sit the same test, all the foundation tier will sit the same test. And then we will generate rank orders from those standardized scores. And from those standardized scores and those rank orders, we'll be looking at the grade distribution. And clearly, those students who finish higher in a rank order will get the higher grades. And that way it mitigates against any student feeling that the teacher's being unkind to them or unfair, and also mitigates against generous or conservative marking. All of those papers will have clear mark schemes and the work will be moderated within the departments. I'm hoping that all subjects can utilise multiple assessment tasks, and the reason I say hope rather than they all will is there are some subjects where all the way through, and I'm thinking more in the vocational areas, that there have been assessments and there may already be 4 or 5 assessment pieces, in which case there's only 1 or 2 things left to assess. But in most subjects, I'm expecting multiple assessment tasks. And then the raw scores across the department will be assigned a grade, and these should be aggregated. So if a student were to do 5 assessment pieces, for example, and get a 5, 4, 4, 4, and 4 in them, then ultimately we will predict a 4. Now, I can see that the students achieved a 5, and it could be argued that that student's potential is a 5, but the key thing is in bold at the bottom. The focus is on what a student is currently achieving. It is this we have to predict. And as you can see from that range of scores, what the student is currently performing, currently achieving, is a 4 on a consistent basis. There will always be variance between tests where you do better in some and slightly worse in others, but generally that student is a 4. If there is a negative outline performance, we will eliminate it. So the next person down got 5, 5, 5, 4, 1. The chances are that 1 was recorded because they either messed up the test or the teacher hasn't taught it particularly well, or it could be that that was a piece of work that was being studied when that individual student had to self-isolate or was unwell or their class was disrupted. So any of those negative outlying results where they're just outside of the norm of what we would expect, we will disregard from the calculation. So in that case, because that student, if you get rid of that 1, is consistently achieving a 5, we'd be predicting a 5 for that student. The key thing I would say here, and I really need to stress all the way through, is that we have a mutual objective, which is for the students to be rewarded with the best possible grades that they deserve. And ultimately, although it may feel that the students have been disadvantaged for the last 2 years, and I would agree that it's been so disjointed, their education, they've missed out on so much of the good things in school, all of the extracurricular activities, all of the engagement with teachers, their ability to socialise with their peers. Actually, the assessment process that we're going to use is going to be to their advantage. they have the opportunity to have an assessment, which last year they didn't have when it was just on teacher predicted grades. And there may be some students out there, and I would have probably fallen into this category when I was a student, who haven't done enough work for the last couple of years under the premise that they think that they can just resolve it when they get to an exam. Last year, that opportunity never arose, and those students didn't get the grades that they might have thought they could have achieved in an exam. This year, those students are going to have those assessment opportunities if they think they could actually do better in assessments than they've been displaying in class. But we've still got the protection of classwork. And if anyone does poorly in any of the assessments, we can either redo the assessment, or if it's a big negative outlier like we've got on display on this slide, we can remove it. Now, in terms of classwork, when the aggregation of the test is complete, the teachers will review whether the assessments align with the classwork. And where a student has underperformed, a case for an adjustment should be made. So if a teacher's there thinking, I've got a really good student here, they're going to get a 7, and they've got consistently tests at a 5, the teacher can say to the head of the department and say, well, actually, no, I think this student should be a 7. And the reason I think they should be a 7 is, look, this is all of their class working assessments they've done in class, and it's all at grade 7. And we will look at that and go, yeah, there's lots of evidence of grade 7 work, and therefore we can award a higher grade. And that's for work that was done in class. It's for work that was done during remote learning. Any piece of work that's been done in the last 2 to 3 years during the GCSEs, we will take into consideration for that assessment. The key thing here is that there still has to be the evidence to show, though. So it's not just a teacher's feeling that that student is a 7. They need to actually have had assessed work at that level. So if exam boards come knocking and say, right, you've awarded that student a grade 7, can we see the evidence of where you derived that grade? We can demonstrate, yeah, this is where the work was submitted, which was grade 7, and that's where we based our grade. So students have got the protection of all the work they've done in class, as well as those assessments in terms of calculating the most accurate grade. At the end of the process, heads of department will have to sign off on the fact that grades are an accurate reflection of student performance, and then I review them and sign them off as head of centre. When I review them, and I'm going to be brutally honest, I do not know how every single year 11 student is performing in each of their classes. So I look at the grades that have been predicted by the departments, and I compare them to the tracking data that students have received in the last couple of years. And if there's an anomaly where a grade is lower than the tracking data, I go back to the department and say, right, why are we saying that this student's not achieved the grades that we had predicted up until this point? It's just a little safety net to make sure that we are accurate in what we're predicting. And the departments may come back to me and say, well, that's because they've done all of these assessment, and when we've actually looked at the classwork, it's not been to the standard that we were hoping. So I'm not guaranteeing that you will get the grades that you've been predicted all the way through, but we've got that as a safety net there just as a check. Now, I have to apologise to students because this is a presentation I've also shared with our staff. And when it comes to the transparency that we've talked about in the grading structure, I'm asking the staff to be absolutely frank with students going forward. So normally, if a student had done a piece of work, which say, for example, was a grade 5, historically, we've encouraged teachers to be aspirational, to really encourage and say, that's excellent. If you carry on like this, you will get a grade 7. For the next 6 weeks, 8 weeks until we get to the end of year 11, I'm asking the teachers just to tell students exactly what that piece of work is. So if they produce a piece of work, which is grade 5, I'm asking the teacher to say, right, that's a piece of work that's grade 5. And the reason for that is if we go back to the previous example and teachers say, that's excellent, if you carry on like this, you'll get a grade 7. The student starts going, oh, great, I'm going to get a grade 7 in that subject, when actually all the work that there is to evidence is still at grade 5 level. And that causes that misunderstanding, which leads to disappointment when it comes to the exam grade. So we need that transparency for this short period of time. And I apologise to students if they feel, if they're getting told, oh, that's at that level. But, that transparency is all important. So there's no misunderstanding and everyone knows where they stand. I will stress this at this point in time, the exam dispensation must be given in all assessment activities. So if students are entitled to extra time, a scribe, a laptop, different colour papers, they must be given in the formal assessments that go on. Now, teachers may still set little interim class assessments during the period up until the 26th of April, and they they will go with the kind of dispensation that can be allowed within that normal classroom setting. So that's hopefully as much as possible. But when we come to the formal assessments, we will give full exam dispensation. We're not doing any mock exams this year. And the reason we're not doing any mock exams is by the time we've got the mocks completed, we would almost need to go straight into the formal assessment stage of the process. And that doesn't give enough time to actually reflect on the mocks, make improvements and go on. So there may still be little mock tests that take place in classes as preparation for when the more formalised assessments that were used to calculate grades are used. Now, when I say about the formalised assessments, it's nothing like a normal exam year. Assessments will not necessarily take place in the Oaks Theatre, and I'm encouraging my staff to set assessments which are no longer than an hour. So we're not looking at setting full English papers or full maths papers or massive long history papers. It's small papers, probably of about 45 minutes, focused around one or two topics, which we tell you about beforehand, so you've got the time to prepare and revise for, and then the assessment is given. As I say, we want students to be able to demonstrate the best possible outcomes that they can, so we can give them the best possible grades that we can, bearing in mind that they've had this very disruptive education. Assessments can be conducted in classrooms, and spacing does not have to conform to examination conditions. So we're not going to have invigilators wandering up and down the rows in every single environment. If it's one of those tests where copying is not really viable, I mean, if you're doing something like art, copying is not really viable. If you're writing a history extended essay, it's very difficult to copy. Then those kind of tests can go on very easily in a classroom without the kind of need for exam board spacing. We will use the Oaks Theatre for some tests. So, for example, if we're doing a small test in maths, and Mr. Casey is concerned that if he gives it out in a classroom environment, then because we don't all teach all of the year 11 maths at the same time, that by the time the second tranche of students come around to do that maths test, they would know what the questions were. We might get the whole cohort into the Oaks Theatre so they can all do the test at the same time. So there's a quality in that process. And we'll also probably have the spacing in place for a test like maths or science where there's short answer questions, because obviously we do need academic integrity and make sure that students don't copy where the opportunities do exist to easily copy the exam scripts. We will make a timetable of assessments available to students over Easter, so you know exactly when your tests are coming up, and then you know what topics are covered in each of those tests. But we may put on that it's an assessment week rather than a specific date, and that's just to reflect the fact that some of these tests will be done just normally in classroom time, and it just depend on when you have that lesson in your timetable, but it'll give you an indication of that week, and again, your individual teachers will be able to give you more information about when those tests are there. If you've done a lot of coursework already, and I'm thinking more with a vocational, it would be used to calculate your grade. Obviously, if you've done a BTEC at City and Guilds and you've already done 4 pieces of work and they're all at merit standard, then clearly that's going to factor into the grade calculation. However, if those retake opportunities, for example, you've done 1 unit and you've got a pass, but you could have retaken it at the end of the year, you're not condemned to having that pass as being the fundamental of your grade prediction. We can still predict higher if that retake opportunity exists. But obviously, if you've done 5 tests and they've all been at pass level and your teacher predicts you a distinction overall, it's fairly likely the exam boards are going to come in and question why we suddenly decided to raise you to 2 grades. Some key dates for you to be aware of. Results need to be submitted by the Friday 18th of June, and therefore the last day of teaching for year 11 and 13 students will be Friday 11th of June. So as I've said, we do assessments up until the May half term. After the May half term, up to the 11th of June, it's only a very short period of time, but we'll still do some assessments, but they're more likely to be geared around students who have not displayed what we were expecting. So if, for example, we've got a student who we think should be getting a particular grade and their assessments have not matched up with that, and we're lacking the evidence to give them the grade, we'll probably target certain students and say, right, can you take this paper? It's going to be on these topics, revise for it, because we just want to get the evidence to give you a higher grade. So up until Friday 11th of June, the testing is likely to be far more targeted. So the results days for students this year, sixth form is the 10th of August, and for year 11, it's the 12th of August. Just a few little notes. We're not allowed to tell students or parents what grades we submit to the exam boards, and that's simply because there is still a moderation procedure. There's no algorithm this year. Theoretically, whatever we submit, we should get back as a student grades. But if we submit grades and the exam boards go, well, that looks suspiciously high, they may come in and check and moderate our procedures. I'm expecting some form of moderation or evaluation of our grades this year, and they don't want us to say to students, you've got this, and then they come in and moderate our grades, and actually the outcomes are slightly lower. However, to let you know, or give you a very clear indicator of what we are likely to be giving, I intend to provide an interim assessment to year 11 and 13 shortly before the May half term, which should provide a very clear indication. Now, obviously, because that's being given out before the May half term, I can honestly turn around to the exam boards and say, I have not told you the grades that we're submitting, because there is still time for those grades to be changed up until June the 11th, but it will give you a very clear indication of where you stand with only a short period of time left before the final submission. If you disagree on the grades given on that interim assessment, speak to your teacher after the half term. But remember, you must be able to show consistent work at the grade you feel you deserve. So if you get a grade back and go, oh, I'm not very happy with that grade, I want a higher one, it has to be justified under the basis that all the work you've done has been at that higher grade. You can't just go and see your teacher and say, oh, but I need this grade to get into my sixth form. They're not going to change the grade just because it meets your wish list. It has to be reflective of the work that you've done. And if it is, please do go and see your teacher, because, you know, we've obviously got thousands of grading decisions to make. And I'd like to think that with all of our processes, we don't make any mistakes. But if we do, I'd rather rectify it before we actually submit finally for the exam boards. But please remember that it has to be on the basis of the work that you've done, not what you feel you deserve or your potential or what grade that you want for further work. It has to be on the basis of the work that you've done for that date. There are likely to be appeals after the exam board, but remember, if it's anything like last year's appeals process, it has to be focused around demonstrating that you've been discriminated against if you wish to have your grade changed. And there's actually two kind of lines. One is an admin error, but we do the appeals on an admin error because last year the exam board did mess up a couple of grades where we submitted them on an Excel sheet and they gave the students the wrong grades. So we will instantly appeal those. The second one is if you feel you've been discriminated against. I'd like to think that you will not have a case to suggest that you've been discriminated against, because we will try and put in everything we can to ensure that everyone is given their entitlement in terms of the exams and the grading. And certainly there's an awful lot of processes in there. So ultimately the appeals process may be fairly fruitless, but obviously we do have lots of protocols in place as we go through, so you can see where you're heading and you can raise those issues with your teachers if you think that you're not getting the reward that you should be. And lastly, because we've already had a number of inquiries on these, Year 11 Prom, we're looking to arrange this for July if the COVID easing continues as planned. So please don't worry about it, don't panic about it. We'll try and take care of that. And if people just want to concentrate on their assessments, it would be absolutely outstanding. So that is essentially how we're looking to calculate the grades for this academic year for Year 11. Year 13 is fairly similar, but there are some slight processes that we do differently. I just want to stress something that I've said already within the video, and that is ultimately that it's been an incredibly difficult year for Year 11, both when they were in Year 10 and throughout Year 11. I felt they were in a fantastically good place before the lockdown in Christmas, and I would have still quite liked the exams to run through as normal, because I think our students would have done very, very well compared to national averages. We are committed to making sure that the students do the very best they can in those examinations, and everything that we've done in terms of the processes are not to create stress or difficulties for students. It's just to ensure that two things: one, that we do the process with equality and everyone gets the grades that they deserve, and secondly, that we gain the evidence that we need, that if we were challenged by an exam board on the grades that we've given out, that we can turn around and say, yeah, those students definitely deserve those grades, and there's no danger of us being moderated down by an exam board later on. I know students may feel a little bit stressed, and they're in a situation where they go, oh, but we've missed all of this school. I would actually say that the grading and the way that we calculate your grades this year are less stressful than in a normal year. You've got that consideration of the work that you've done in school. you've got multiple assessments, and instead of one or two big exams. If you mess up an exam, we will give you an opportunity to retake that paper, or we'll disregard it if we realise that it was just not taught well because of COVID, or you had missed that time. So there are lots of protections in place to make sure students do themselves justice in those examinations. I think you have had a very rough time, as I've said before, in terms of the wider scope of education. But I'm committed to make sure that when it actually comes to the calculations of your grades, you're very well supported. If there are any inquiries, in the meeting we had yesterday, Mr. Lloyd sat in on it and has listened to this presentation pretty much twice, once when I gave it to staff and once when I gave it to the year 11. So please inquire with him. If there are particular issues in terms of the department's areas, please contact those directly. I expect to get the examination timetable to you around about the Easter holidays. I apologise, we can't give it out straight away. As I alluded to earlier, we didn't know what the framework for assessment was going to be until last week, and the teachers are now going away and looking at that. And equally, we are unlikely to receive the exam board assessment materials until the end of this month. Early April is a kind of indication, so it makes it very difficult for us to start producing those timetables before we have an idea of what the materials are going to look like. But as soon as we can physically do it, we will get it back to you. The last thing I want to say is I'm really looking forward to seeing everyone next week, initially for testing on Monday or the Wednesday if you're doing the catch-up, and then back in school as normal on Thursday. Make use of the time that you're in school. It's going to be very much geared towards you maximising your performance in examinations, and I wish you the very best of luck with those as we go through the year. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video.